is to analyse the existing society and to give a description of the conditions under which the working class in that society, the oppressed and exploited class in that society, can attain its liberation. And that is one of the best and most concise descriptions of what Marxism does, that I think that the founders or anybody else made. The thing that needs to be added to, or the most important thing in terms of the discussion that we're embarking on this evening that needs to be added to that, is that unlike most theories that you're taught about in academic institutions, or indeed you might learn about in political life generally, this involves a degree of partisanship, so to say. It involves a degree of engagement. In fact, the point of Engels' definition is that you cannot accurately understand the way in which the society works other than by looking at it from the point of view of the oppressed and exploited class within it. Now that, for a start off, stands in flat contradiction to most of what you're taught in history and the social sciences in academia. There you're taught that you are in some way outside the society or hovering above the society, that you are neutral in its various sort of storms and stresses, and that you must try to understand them from a point of view of detachment. The starting point of Marxism is that you cannot gain an accurate view of the society on this basis. It's partly to do with the fact that, in actual fact, no such point of detachment actually exists. We are all placed somewhere in the society, and all the institutions in the society bear the mark of their relationship to the power structure of society, including academic institutions. So there is no cloud hovering above the society on which we are placed, and from which we look down on the society with kind of, godlike detachment and see how it moves. That's not possible. It's not available. It's not possible. It's a utopia to think that such a space actually exists. In one way or another, everybody is engaged. In one way or another, everybody is placed in a position where partisanship is required of them in some form. The most honest way of dealing with this is to examine possible points of view, the possible partisanships that are available, and to make a choice about which partisanship gives you the best possible vantage point for understanding the truth about the society. And I guess that one way, one simple and crude way of putting this, is that if in some way or another you are linked to those institutions in the society which are provided to you by the rich and powerful, you're less likely to be able to gain an accurate view of the way in which society works, because interests are involved, and material interests of wealth and power are involved in those institutions, and a point of view which is detached from that, which is located amongst those people who don't have either wealth or power or a stake in society, is liable to give you a more accurate view of the way in which society works than any other standpoint that you might be able to adopt. And it's from that point of view, really, that the famous quotation, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach that Meyer quoted at the beginning of the meeting attains its full force. That philosophers have so far only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. Is about engagement. Is about partisanship. It's about understanding where you are located in society, what the different interests of wealth and power and ownership are in society, and what you might possibly be able to do about it. It's not an additional or minor element of Marxist theory. It's rooted right at the heart of it. Indeed, actually, it's rooted right at the heart of what Marx and Engels regard as being a uniquely human characteristic, in the sense that they had a view of what human nature was comprised of. It wasn't any of the traditional views that people are, naturally avaricious or ambitious or seek power or want wealth, or the normal sort of run-of-the-mill Daily Mail view of what human nature might be. They had the view that human beings had the unique capacity to transform the world around them. There's a famous passage where Marx compares human capacities to that of a bee. And he says that the difference between a human architect and a bee is that the bee can construct an absolutely perfect geometrical honeycomb, but it does so from instinct. A human architect, Marx says, even the worst human architect, erects in their mind the structure that they're going to attempt to build before they build it. In other words, they are engaged in a conscious process of trying to transform the world around them. This is what's definitional for Marx about human labour in any department, mental labour, physical labour, the elementary business of transforming the world around us so that we're able to live in it is the business of conscious effort deployed to transform the world. And their view of political practice or political activity is an extension of that view. It's a particular type of human labour. So a consciously deployed collective labour of trying to transform the political and economic conditions of the world around you. And that can only be done from a point of view of collective political organisation. And indeed, anything that you see or touch around you is a product of such labour. This table, that carpet, those windows, this building are all about the consciously, collectively deployed business of human labour transforming the world around you. And political practice, political organisation, the attempt to change things politically or economically, is simply a subset of that kind of activity. Okay, so much for the kind of fundamental basis of what, or at least as much as I can say in the time available, about the sort of philosophical basis, the social basis, the location in society from which Marxism springs. A little bit about the rise of academia. Now, academia hasn't always been with us. It is a product, a relatively recent product of the way in which society works, certainly in its modern forms. Of course, for very large stretches of human history, education was religious education. It took place in and through religious institutions. In the Middle Ages, insofar as universities existed, they were very much either under the tutelage of religious organisations, or subordinate to them, or a minority of the education that was available. And this meant that, as far as certainly political and historical thought was concerned, insofar as it came to depart from religious interpretations of the world, it was a product of the original revolutions that transformed the society from its feudal pattern into a recognisably modern capitalist society. So the great so-called bourgeois revolutions, or the classical revolutions, the English Revolution of 1649, the French Revolution of 1789, American Revolution of 1776, and so forth, imparted a huge impulse to the scientific study of political life. And if you think about much liberal theory, still today, it is recognisably, in this country certainly, a descendant of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and David Hume and the Enlightenment thinkers, the Scottish Enlightenment, and those that were directly propelled out of the English Revolution. Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan directly as a political and philosophical response to the English Revolution. John Locke inherited much of his democratic thought from the English Republic and from the levellers of the English Revolution, and so forth and so on. Similarly, in France, if you think about the encyclopedias of Voltaire and Diderot and so forth, that was both a precursor and given an enormous thrust by the experience of the French Revolution and so forth and so on. The thing to note about this was that these were not people who were engaged primarily in academic institutions. They were, if you like, gentlemen, and they were nearly all gentlemen, philosophers, who were representing the political thought of their class. They were to a degree politically engaged. Often these people were actually active in politics themselves. And so at this point, you haven't got a kind of firewall between so-called scientific inquiry and political engagement. This comes later with the creation of a kind of stable university system. I just want to, the historian Lawrence Stone, a good historian, not Marxist historian actually, but a very good historian, Lawrence Stone has described this process. He says that between 1870 and 1930, he's talking primarily about the discipline of history, says history developed into an independent professional discipline in its own right. Separate history departments were created in the universities, PhD programs for the training and accreditation of future professionals were instituted, professional associations were formed. Meanwhile, the prime subject matter of history, under the influence of bourgeois liberal nationalism, was defined as administrative and constitutional evolution of the nation-state and diplomatic and military relations of those states. National record offices were set up, and so forth and so on. So the point I'm making, I'm just gesturing to it here, I don't have time to elaborate in any great detail, is that there's a certain point towards the end of the Victorian age when the university system becomes professionalised, when departments are created, when it becomes an institution, not simply the business of kind of gentlemen political activists who have the leisure to be able to engage in philosophical or scientific inquiry. The expansion, of course, of the system beyond that, and it stays in that form, really, right up until after the Second World War, and it's really only the institution of the welfare state and the beginning of the grant system, now of beloved memory, that massively opens up the educational system, albeit still relatively exclusively of the middle classes. I think even at the peak of this, you've only got something like 10 or 15% of students coming from working class backgrounds actually making it into the university system. And with that, there's a certain departmentalisation, specialisation of the study of knowledge. The previous generation were generalists. They didn't recognise, and nor would they have found at all scientific, the idea of specialised departments. You see, when people talk about Marx being an economist, of course, he never referred to himself in that way. That's a modern invention. What he thought he was studying, what Adam Smith and David Ricardo, his great sort of classical peers, thought they were studying, was something called political economy. It was something which didn't have a barrier between politics and economics, or politics and sociology, or economics and sociology. It was a general study of society. And that specialisation has a particular kind of effect on the way in which you absorb knowledge. This is one commentator writing, it says, disciplinary and professional mechanisms within each of the social sciences limit the development of thought and maintain a degree of fragmentation which is quite extreme. The academic organisation of social knowledge requires, in order to keep the work of individual researchers within established forms and processes, the existence of a large number of discrete disciplines. The redivision of the social sciences into more and more narrow fields, which continues apace, admirably serves the purpose of the academic structure of social knowledge. The more narrow the definition of the field, the more specific the technical forms of research can be, the more rigid the formal and substantive standards which operate. In addition to this, it satisfies the specific financial and prestige requirements of various intellectual groups and institutions. So the way in which you experience the acquisition of knowledge in modern academic institutions is not a timeless or neutral business. It's a historical creation. It has certain effects on the way in which you study. It has certain limitations on the way in which you conceive the world. Anybody who's done any research will know that this is rigidly enforced. So we got on very well after that, but it's not actually the pursuit of knowledge in a sort of broad and encompassing way. Even at PhD level, don't mind about what you're expected to do further down the food chain. Okay, so that's a little bit about academia. Now a little bit about Marxism and academia. Marxism as a theory, of course, developed out of and in the closest possible relationship to the working class struggle. Marx and Engels themselves were engaged in the 1848 revolutions in Europe. The Communist Manifesto was a sort of, by a few months, a precursor to this. They were deeply influenced by the Chartist movement, the first ever working class movement in this country, and even the more abstruse theoretical work that they did, the critique of Hegelian philosophy, or Marx's labours in the British Library just over the road there on Capital, were closely connected, interwoven with the business of the working class struggle in the period in which they lived. Neither of them were ever professional or academic researchers. Engels, of course, famously had to keep Marx from the product of the Engels and Irving factory in Manchester, and Marx endured periods of intense poverty. Whenever there was a chance to be engaged in the working class movement, either in 1848 or again in the foundation of the First International in 1870, or again in Engels in later life with the beginnings of socialist organisation and the new unions, they were intensely engaged in it, and theory couldn't possibly develop in the form that it did without that engagement. That was true, really, of all the classical figures in the Marxist tradition. If you think of those that works that you're directed to study, if you're going to study Marxism, you think of Marx and Engels themselves, Rosa Luxemburg, of Lenin, of Trotsky. This is true of the entirety of the classical corpus of Marxism. It couldn't have been otherwise, really. There wasn't a university system that was open to those kind of people and that kind of way of thinking. It was a closed, very elite system up until the post-war period, as I've said. Probably the only exception to that is in the 1930s. The crisis in the system was so great that it even began to impinge on the lives of people in highly elite institutions like that. And at that time, some people engaged with the communist movement and at the same time in elite institutions were influenced by Marxist ideas. That tells us more about the sheer scale of the crisis in the 1930s, the radicalisation that was attendant on it, than it does about the link between the two. The only point where there becomes an overlap is in the period after the massive expansion of higher education in the post-war period, and particularly during the radicalisation of the 1960s. But the hallmark of that radicalisation in academia, and I'm not talking about the way in which the student movement arose, I'm talking about the theoretical work and the academic figures who kind of drifted towards a certain form of Marxism at that time. The defining characteristic of that generation of theorists, unlike the classical generation, was of separation between political engagement, political practice, and theoretical work. Perianson, in his study of Western Marxism, makes this point. Just let me quote it a moment. He says that the first and most fundamental of its characteristics of the new left in academia has been a structural divorce of this Marxism from political practice. The organic unity of theory and practice realised in the classical generation of Marxists before the First World War, who performed an inseparable politico-intellectual function within their respective parties in Eastern and Central Europe, was to be increasingly severed in the half-century from 1918 to 1968 in Western Europe. And I would say that really is a kind of headstone which stands over the theoretical work which happened during that period. It is rooted in a quite different dynamic, and its fundamental difference with the originators of the classical Marxist tradition and their inheritors is its separation from political practice. Even if you think about people who, for instance, formed probably the single most dynamic theoretical group that there's been in the history of British Marxism, the British Marxist historians that were E.P. Thompson, Christopher Hill, Rodney Hilton, and so forth. They were Communist Party members and trained in the Communist Party historians group. I mean, they later became incredibly successful academically. Christopher Hill went on to be Master of Balliol College, Oxford, and so forth and so on. But where they got their training was in the business of being practically engaged in trying to alter the world through political organisation. And I simply want to end on this point, that scholasticism and impenetrable theory and ideas which have little effect on the political process are bound to take place where that separation is enforced. But where the study of theory becomes an end in itself, where one generation of theorists simply makes its mark by criticising the preceding generation of theorists, and then another generation of theorists comes along that criticises them, where you accept the departmental divisions between different forms of study of society, where there is little engagement with the practical struggle of the working class movement or attempt to change society, or any collective organisation at all geared to political activity, the sterility is almost certain to result. The vitality of political theory, its ability to see what is important and what is not, to be able to be useful to working people in their attempts to transform and better their conditions, depends on engagement, depends on being part and parcel of a movement for change. Separated from that, the power system is pulled out of the heart of the machine. What drives theoretical inquiry, what makes or can make it inventive and insightful, is a connection to people's ability to transform the world. The only way of properly testing whether a theory is effective and correct is, as Marx says in the 11th thesis, is the engagement, is the ability to try and transform the world. As he put it in another thesis on Feuerbach, the this-sidedness of thinking, i.e. whether or not it actually has attraction in the world, is proved in practice, is proved by the process of application. So, of course, there are many things that can be learned and much time that can be properly spent in academic institutions, but accepting the framework that they provide you with is not the most effective way or the most effective theoretical way of understanding the way in which society works. And this is a very, very old story. One of the earliest just want to finish on this, one of the earliest kind of criticisms of academic thought, of the detachment of academic thought, of its lack of engagement, was made right at the beginning of this whole process, so I'll go back to it, by John Milton, who, you know, we know best today as the author of Paradise Lost, but who was also a revolutionary and a politically engaged person. He was the Secretary for Foreign Tongues, essentially the Foreign Secretary in Cromwell's Republic. He was someone who narrowly escaped execution as a regicide at the time of the Restoration. And he made an oration to the gathered colleges of Cambridge at the time of the English Revolution. And the title of the oration was Against Scholastic Philosophy. And he told the gathered colleges of Cambridge that their ignorance and absurd childishness, when faced with any new situation outside their usual idiotic occupation, was the result of which was to make you a more finished fool and a cleverer contriver of conceits, and to endow you with a more expert ignorance. And frankly, I still think there's a lot of that about in academia, and it stems from a lack of engagement with the society around it, and a lack of engagement with attempts to transform the society around it, and that is still a hallmark of the division between Marxism and academic Marxism.
We should engage in struggle. The answer is revolution. It's amazing how, you know, teachers think that I'm a total loony bin. I quite enjoy those essays still. Nevertheless, my marks aren't brilliant. But yeah, so I can tell you from first-hand experience what it's like academic Marxism.
I second that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously I've been talking in large generalisations about whole institutions of thought and general patterns of thought. The questions that Alistair's raising require us to get a little bit below that, so let me try and do a little bit of that. The Enlightenment thinkers, either the English Enlightenment thinkers or the French Enlightenment thinkers, are a theoretical reflection on revolutions that have taken place or are taking place. It is perhaps a comment on that entire tradition when, in probably the greatest of them, in Hegel's philosophy, he makes the point, one of the most beautiful pieces of writing actually, where he says that the owl of Minerva idea, i.e. human knowledge, flies only with the coming of the dusk. Then philosophy paints its grey on grey when a form of life has grown old. In other words, what he's saying, what he's reflecting there, is that what tends to happen with the philosophers of the bourgeois revolutions is that they're reflections on events that have taken place. The actual, if you want to know where the intellectual work actually took place, it took place among the first generation of people actually engaged in the revolution, very close to the revolution. The Levellers, John Milburn, Harrington, and so forth and so on. And then you get after this, even though Thomas Hobbes was a contemporary of the revolution, you get sort of post facto deliberations on that and the influence of the classical Republican theories like Milton and Harrington's Oceana and the Levellers on Locke is still a very busy scholarly business. So in those revolutions, you don't get thought as a kind of a theoretical precursor of it so much as a product of the process as it develops. And this wave, of course, is a completely international wave. The English Revolution, the American Revolution, 1776, the French Revolution, and as it goes on, the theoretical and philosophical artifice and the body of work grows in response to this sort of mounting wave of transformation of the old feudal society into a modern capitalist society. Marx's point, the philosophers have only interpreted the world, is in a way, Marx thinks were students of Hegel, is the owl of Minerva turned on its head. Whatever you do with the owl of Minerva anyway. Rather unfortunate image of the poor owl being stood upside down here. But for Hegel, the idea that thought came after the fact and generalised it was a good thing. For Marx, it's a critique of previously existing philosophy, that it doesn't actively engage in the business of contemporary transformation of the society, and that's one of the breaks between the Enlightenment philosophers, including Hegel, and Marxism as a system. That's part of the Marxist critique of it. Of course, it's not true that every valuable thinker is necessarily engaged, or not every valuable artist is necessarily directly engaged in this business. Although they all have a relationship to it, however mediated and abstracted, there is always something there which is reflective of the relations within the society, even if it's a rejection of that, even if it's an attempt to fly to high abstraction and to distance oneself from it. It is nevertheless a sort of relationship with the society around it. So it's not really the points that I'm making aren't necessarily about every artist, not necessarily about every theorist. They're about schools of thought which are in the business of trying to transform the world. So the talk is about Marxism and academic Marxism, although I'd also argue that lack of engagement in any level of scientific inquiry is a less helpful point of departure, a less advantageous point of departure than engagement. With the question of, should we start kind of, tabula rasa a blank tablet every time. No, because you know, if human endeavour and intellectual work and power struggles mean anything, they should mean that we don't start from a blank slate, that there have been intellectual achievements in the past, there have been intellectual effort in the past, and we have to assess what that effort and what those achievements are, which stand and which fail, which are useful and which are not. And this is true in any area of science. On the whole, even though Newtonian physics has been superseded by atomic physics, we still understand this was a staging post on the way to what we know now, and that the competing theories of the time, more or less mystical, more or less superstitious, are forgotten as effective parts of modern knowledge. They might be studied by historians and antiquaries, but they're not part of the modern body of thought. And the social sciences and sciences about how you transform the world are to be evaluated in a similar way. Which forms of thought have been most useful in the past, which have most accurately described the world, which have stood the test of time better than others? Did some of Marx's critics, like Proudhon or Bakunin, do we still study their analysis of capital society as usefully and find as useful as what Marx wrote in Capital? I would argue not. So let's begin with those that seem to be most effective, to have stood the test of time. There may well be things, it's an open system. Of course, not everything that Marx or Engels or any of the Marxists wrote are infallible. Some of it is wrong, but as a body of thought, is it the best starting point? Is it the best point of departure? Is it the most useful way of viewing society if we want to make further analytical, further theoretical progress? Yes, it is. Is it disputed in the way, you know, is it unpopular? Well, to be honest, theories which say that the poor should dispossess the rich are generally unpopular, and I think we have to just work with this thought. You know, John Ball, the head priest of the Peasants' Revolt, when he said that, you know, when Adam Dell, the new span, who was then a gentleman, he wasn't popular. John Littlewood was not popular for saying that there should be a democratic society. Oppositional views which want to dispossess those who have wealth and power and to spread it more equally through the society aren't popular. And in academia, Marxism isn't popular generally. So, yeah, my heart bleeds, of course, but yeah, one of the useful disciplines in life is if you're going to write this stuff, you have to be probably 30% better than the people who are writing that Adam Smith knew what he was on about, that free market economics is absolutely marvellous, and that George Osborne is completely correct and the recession will be over any day now. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions, contributions?
If it's okay, I've kind of got two. First of all, like, I know you've touched on it, but I kind of wanted a more clear idea of, certainly in the natural and physical sciences, there's a very poignant argument for research in terms of knowledge for knowledge's sake, because a lot of the most important discoveries we've made today through those kind of sciences have actually been byproducts of what they call pure research. So I wondered what stance you had on that in terms of, like, what political theory, like, is there a point to knowledge for knowledge's sake in sort of work produced from its offshoots? And also, if you are encouraging academic Marxism to go hand in hand with, you know, with practice, and that must equally apply to every other political theory, that it's most effective when it's also, like, it's theorised and it's applied in practice. Therefore, as you're encouraging everyone to practice it, it's encouraging with every political theory a certain notion of progress. Therefore, I was wondering, A, can you, like, justify to us why your conception of the Marxist progress is better than the others? And also, if, for example, everyone did practice and theorise in the same manner, if another conception of progress won out over Marxism, would you consider that valid or legitimate? If not, why not?
I have a question that's related to that. You mentioned the idea of academic neutrality, which you said just doesn't exist, which I agree with, but you didn't really explain lazy man, who heard about his former college having the EDS campaign lecture, seminar kind of thing. And it was an event that was speaking out against Israel, promoting the BDS campaign. And he said that was biased, and it was wrong of his college to do that. So, in order to solve the problem and bring back academic neutrality, they should have had a pro-Israel event which condemned the BDS campaign, which is ridiculous, right? So, how would you, what kind of alternative system would you offer, whereby Marxist theory could be put forward in academia, as well as other political theories? Could they coexist in theory and in practice? Or would we have to have a Marxist system of education top-down?
Just on the knowledge for knowledge's sake, science and the rest of it, I mean, I think there's a kind of deep problem here that the science we actually have, the body of knowledge we have that we call science, has itself changed in the way it's produced over the last 200 years or so. It's changed since capitalism arrives. That you do have kind of pre-scientific knowledge of various sorts that looks in a certain way, and then you can develop to the scientific method, to the experimental method, and then you get refined to this process. Connected to the Enlightenment, connected to people like Francis Bacon and Galileo and all the rest of it. But this process of producing that kind of knowledge we call science is something that has changed itself over time. So by the time you actually get here and say we are doing pure research, you're not. You're doing kind of research that's already arrived with a certain set of history. And in particular, you can see that coming through very strongly, at least with the growth and the expansion of scientific research, the incredible amount of resources that start to go into it, particularly after the end of the Second World War, but really going all the way back through the 20th century, is that whatever scientists happen to think they're doing, you move from a kind of amateur approach to it. You move to an approach where capitalism as such doesn't really intrude on what scientists do. A lot of the sort of early modern scientists, people a bit later on, are essentially kind of enthusiastic amateurs. They're people who are rich enough to be able to go and do experiments on the side. And then you get the gradual expansion of capitalism, the progressive investment into scientific research that starts to change how science is produced into something that is itself mass-produced. So you get whole teams of scientists working on problems. I mean, the classic example of this is the pharmaceutical industry, where you go very, very rapidly from the discovery of penicillin in the 1930s to, by the 1950s, having huge machines that are established, the sort of machinery of these big pharmaceutical companies, to pump scientific research in at one end, and then there's a pipeline, and out the other end you get new pills. And there's an experimental method that they completely use Fordist methods to take the knowledge and break it down and turn it into something else and get some pills out the other side. It's very hard with any methods to see where you get knowledge for its own sake. You know, even something that's totally abstract, the Large Hadron Collider. You know, the prospects of this being used for anything practical anytime soon are fairly remote. Yet in order to get there, you have to have a massive industrial process to set the thing up, to employ other people. There's a managerial element involved on a colossal scale. It costs absolute fortunes. So expensive, it has to be done by several different countries, never mind individual companies where. The way that then affects knowledge for its own sake and scientific progress for its own sake, I think is quite fundamental to what we end up with in science. Now, there's a bad interpretation of this that basically says all science is essentially bad, and pharmaceuticals are particularly bad because they're just there, you know, the kind of conspiracy theory. They make you ill so they can sell you more pills, essentially kind of critique it. But I think to get anywhere in this one, we have to step back from the very abstract way the philosophy of science is usually presented. This is the philosophy of science, here are the questions. Get into, here is the history of science that imposes certain kinds of philosophical questions. So the question you could answer for the kind of amateur scientists in the 18th century is going to be different to the question you ask of people working in CERN in the 21st century. And that, I think, is where Marxism actually works quite well as a way to answer those sort of questions over how you generate scientific knowledge. I don't know if that particularly got towards any kind of answer. But I think you can't distinguish the two. I think it's trying to distinguish the two, or trying to propose a history of science as separate from the history of history. It becomes a very, very difficult. It is itself a kind of ideological manoeuvre.
Yeah. Well, I think sort of just to follow on from the point there is no Deus ex machina. There is no God outside the machine. There is no, and science is not outside the machine. You think about any of the, the splitting of the atom, the Manhattan Project, the space race, direct consequence of the Cold War, not about landing on the moon, but about proving who's got an intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit the other. There is no outside of the social and political structure. So science always exists, and and how could it be otherwise? The Royal Society in this country founded immediately after the English Revolution on the impulse. All the time, anything you care to touch or look at as a scientific institution is bound to be shaped by the social history before it, the aims of the society within which it develops. So just need to clear that thought out of our minds that there is some sort of, as with social science, there is no cloud above the society on which we can sit and hover free of its influences. That's not a possible place to be. So the question then, of course, is, does that relativise all knowledge? Does that mean that that simply knowledge becomes kind of direct epiphenomenon of the power structure in the society? Well, no, obviously that's not true either. There are genuine discoveries. There are things that we know about the world that we take to be true, or to put it more accurately, are the truest or most accurate picture that we have of the world at this moment. Always falsifiable, always possible that in the future we'll discover other things which make, usually in the history of scientific progress, we find that what we discovered, like in Newtonian physics, that we took to be an absolute picture of the world, turns out to be a more partial picture of the world, which is incorporated within a wider and deeper knowledge of the world. That's partly the nature of scientific progress. Certain other hypotheses are disregarded or thrown aside in that process. Now, this is a genuine acquisition of knowledge. But it would be best if we didn't try to reject surrounding context, but understood that context, and that would give us a better scientific practice than one which says, no, politics stops at the door of the lab. Well, no, it doesn't. So it would be better if we understood how it enters into the lab and structures the work that's being done, including its deep practices, including the kind of separation of the disciplines, including certain forms of scientific method which may exclude other more productive forms of experimentation, and so forth and so on. And there's a number of Marxist scientists, very, very effective Marxist scientists, who've written on this question of Levington-Lewontin's book, The Doctrine of DNA, and Stephen Rose's work on the human brain, and Levington-Lewontin's a dialectical biologist, and so forth. So we've done a lot of absolutely first-class work about what a science like this might be. And when you look at it like that, when you have a kind of social context and an understanding of how this influences the scientific method, you find that the social sciences and the natural sciences aren't quite such separate things as we're led to believe, and certain forms of practice are similar in both. On the question of political engagement across the thing, well, political engagement, it's not really true that political engagement is equally important or equally necessary in all forms of social science. Those forms of social science which are defending the status quo have no need for political practice. They just like it is. The definition of conservatism is the defence of the status quo. We don't need to elaborate the various sort of academic and political theories that back that kind of view of the world up. But what they don't have is any need for a political practice. They like the fact that, and they defend elaborately the idea that a small minority of people have wealth and power, and they have ways of explaining how this is really very good for the rest of us, and trickle down, and we're all rising tide lifts all ships, and so forth and so on. But what they don't need is a political practice. What they need is to stop other people having a political practice. That's what they need. So there's not kind of, it's not a level playing field where kind of, the right right-wing team is on this side of the left-wing and we're all engaged in the practice. No, the playing field looks like this, and they're up there, and we're trying to get up at them. And so we've got needs. We've got need for climbing equipment. They've got need of just pouring boiling oil down on us to stop us acting in that way. So no, I don't think they're the same. They're the same things at all. The neutrality question, academic institution, there isn't going to be a transformation of academia into a neutral body. I mean, it's easier to see this with historical institutions. Now, if you ask yourself, how could the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages have been turned into a body aiming at ecumenical and detached pursuit of knowledge? Well, we know the answer to this is never going to happen because it's part of the power structure of medieval society. Or how is the Church of England under Henry VIII going to become a neutral body aimed at the development of the spiritual needs of the mass of the population and the educational principles involved and the government? That ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen because the Church in medieval society was a combination of the civil service, the education and the media of the day, and its principal point of organisation was to keep the lower classes in their order. That's why it was illegal not to attend church on a Sunday and not to listen to the sermon that was being preached on a Sunday, because this was a direct ideological engagement in disciplining the population. So, to ask how could we transform the medieval church into a neutral body whose aim is the pursuit of knowledge, no, that isn't going to happen. And the universities of the modern era are as built in. I mean, if we didn't know it before, for Christ's sake now, I mean, it's running rampant. I mean, we used to have to make, back in the 70s, we used to have to make the argument that the universities were connected to the corporate structure and the government structure of society. I mean, let's face it, that argument's been won. Marxism is redundant as far as that argument's concerned, because it's bloody obvious that this is what's going on in academic institutions. So, the view of what you should, of course, I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in academic institutions at one time or another, and it's a good place to be, so long as you have a kind of guerrilla raid attitude towards it. But it's a place where you can go, where you have access to ideas, where you have the freedom to organise, to think and to write, but don't accept the structure that's given to you. Go in there, get what you need, use it for a different purpose, but don't be fooled into thinking that what you're doing, or the institution that you're part of, is engaged in the high-minded pursuit of knowledge. It's not. It's structuring the society in a particular way. And a lot of course, the most in any field, a lot of the most innovative thinkers are people who break from that pattern of belief. The rest just become professors.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last round of contributions. Just a couple of quick announcements beforehand. SOAS Counterfire are very concerned not to be academic Marxists, so we've got a ton of events going on pretty much all the time, too much in fact for me to list right now, so do have a little look at the table on your way out. Just firstly to remind everyone that student union elections here at SOAS are next week. Obviously it's really important to have as wide and as high level of participation in these as possible, so that we end up with a decent executive next year that can shake the NUS out of its stupor and back into the streets where it belongs. Sam Duthie, as you've probably guessed from the tables, do you want to give a quick wave, is running for Welfare and Campaigns Officer. So if you have any questions for him or about SOAS Stop the War, which he's the convener of, feel free to ask him at the end. Just a couple of other things. We have a Counterfire members meeting here at SOAS on Saturday in the KLT from 12 noon. So if you're interested in joining or you want to come along and find out more, come and speak to me afterwards. And lastly, the other flyer you've all got on your tables is the Lottery of Earth film screening on the 15th of March, which we're really excited about. The writer and director is coming down for a Q&A, which will be run very much like this, dealing with some very similar themes, ideas about power and expression and education and socialisation and how all that works in a society that's supposed to be both liberal, democratic and capitalistic at the same time. And lots of other stuff. We've got book launches, film screenings, comedy nights coming up in the near future, and of course the People's Assembly Against Austerity, which is the main thing we're mobilising for on campus at the moment. moment, so like I said, if you want any more information on any of that stuff, feel free to come and ask at the end. So on that note, does anyone have any final questions?
Sam mentioned Luke actually. I was wondering if you could say a bit about reification. That's the other thing too, because you started off with power and bias and so on, rather than that, and how those two relate. And yeah, just a quick plug for a meeting with the Stop the War at Pope-Weidemann today. Raga was also about Mali and the intervention there. This Thursday at 6 o'clock. Let's do this round.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
I don't really know how to formulate this question, but well, many things are in my mind now. As Latin American, not necessarily my generation, but previous generations, are, especially scholar generations, are very used to say that the role of the academy was always to participate in the building of the barricades. And you have this image very clearly in countries like Argentina and Uruguay, where left, of course not all of them, but left-wing or Marxist-oriented academics would participate actively in social movements, especially under the military regimes in the 60s and 70s, with, in a particular context that here in Europe it's not at all. I mean, it was not a long time ago, which is complete repression, the importance of working on a double basis, like sometimes on hiding or in secret places, and then also in the academy, the formal, controlled space, etc. And I think that now in the 21st century, we come to an institution like SOAS, in which many professors will call themselves Marxist. We can of course question them and say, well, you're not enough engaged. And they will say, well, yes, our engagement now is perhaps not with the building of the barricades, but we are, how to say that, we are, yeah, I guess, educating the new generations within a particular current of Marxism. I mean, I'm not necessarily married with this idea either, because I also think that that's not enough. I mean, yes, it's good to have, kind of Marxist professors in universities like this one, spreading a little bit of Marxist knowledge. But that's not enough, because that doesn't that doesn't really translate into other kind of political activity. And I wanted to link this somehow to the idea also of being part of a vanguard of the proletariat, because this is a much contested idea, of course, and it has also many interpretations, but up to what extent can we consider, in all these contexts, etc., that this idea is still, relevant for social struggles and especially class struggles. And this.
I have a question, so Ben, if I may. I kind of related to what you were saying earlier about Marxism and the term Marxist as an umbrella and how useful that is. But more specifically, I wanted to ask what you think about the terminology that characterises Marxist discourse traditionally. I mean, we have our own words, the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, to what extent do you think they have maybe become an obstacle given the history of those words and the political culture that we're dealing with in this country particularly, and to what extent do they still have strength relative to the kind of common sense terminology? I mean, for example, the word democracy, I am a Marxist, so when I hear the word democracy, I think of collective ownership of the means of production and a bunch of other things that most people probably don't think about. So to what extent should we be devoting our energies to trying to reclaim those words and promote our definitions of them rather than the kind of more superficial liberal definitions? Or to what extent do we still need our own kind of vocabulary in order to stand apart from that sort of common sense way of looking at words? Does anyone else have anything they want to ask?
Yeah. Okay. Let me start with that question about language. I mean, of course, there is difficulty, and there is an especial difficulty with academic language, which is often these days, when I read some of these, sort of monographs and whatnot, it strikes me that it's almost identical to the way in which in medieval society the ruling class wrote and spoke in Latin as a way of building a barrier between themselves and the mass of the population. I have a vision, really, of academics rather like medieval monks illuminating the manuscripts and pleasing each other and unconcerned whether this has an impact on the wider, or even understood by the wider society. So that I reject. But there is, in every attempt to seriously understand the world, to scientifically understand the world, there is a need for a specialist language. You cannot do modern physics without protons or molecules or quarks or whatever. There is a specialised language which describes things which are not immediately apparent on the surface of the society, and Marxism has some of those terms, has specific terms which have specific meanings, and in order to be able to, you don't need this to make a speech in the student union, you don't need it to write a leaflet, but if you're going to more seriously look at the economic mechanism of the society or understand the deeper structures of politics, then you are going to need some specialised language, and it's necessary to learn it. Now that's something which can be made accessible, can be explained. I always find it actually, the term, when it was first explained to me, it stuck with me for many, many decades now. When I was first told that the reason why Marx used the term proletariat for workers is because the literal meaning of the word is those people who have no other property but their children. And that's a tremendously powerful image of a dispossessed class in society. And knowing that adds a certain depth and weight to the thing that we're looking at and studying that you wouldn't have otherwise, to know the difference between the capitalist class, which are those who literally own the means of production, and the bourgeoisie, which is a wider definition of the kind of lawyers and spokespeople and PR people that surround them. That's quite a useful technical distinction to know. I mean, sometimes we use them interchangeably and casually to be one or the other, but actually, if you start using the technical meaning in certain areas, it's very, very important. Why is it that Richard Branson and Alan Sugar and the head of Barclays Bank don't directly represent themselves in Parliament? Why is it that the biggest single profession in Parliament on all sides are lawyers? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Because lawyers are a group of people who you pay to say anything you want them to say. That's what they do. Guilty, innocent, that's what you do. Oh, sorry, I'm not saying. Sam has obviously left all that behind, but that's good. But that's, that they are professionally paid spokespeople, and it's, that's useful as an analytical tool. So a certain amount of acquiring a scientific language is necessary in any discipline, including Marxism, but unlike most disciplines, it shouldn't be erected as a wall between us and ordinary people. It should be explained, and its usefulness, transmitted to people who haven't yet acquired it. That's a basic principle of education. Since Alistair has introduced the term reification from the Hungarian Marxist George Lukács, just let me say what that meant. What he meant was that certain institutions in the society become worshipped because they have a kind of almost iconic or totemic quality about them, that they become frozen almost, that they become institutionalized, and that they are therefore not questioned. And he meant Marx's term alienation is a related term, which means that rather like the totem poles that American Indians worship, or the cross in the Christian religion or various other institutions, you attribute to an inanimate object powers which are actually human powers. That it's a way of dehumanizing people, and in modern society, far more important than any religious imagery, is the market. The market is said to have certain powers over it. You can't buck the markets, but the markets determine if you do this. Now, this is to attribute human power to an inanimate or non-human institution, which is actually, and this is the bizarre thing, a human creation. And so, just as it was created, it can be uncreated, unnamed, and demystifying, dereifying, overcoming alienation is part of the business of human liberation, part of what a working class struggle is meant to do. I think a very important point about Latin American societies where the social space for a sort of an academic institution to grow, where the political pressure is great, it politicises, obviously, and radicalises in a way that perhaps it doesn't in modern day Britain. There are a number of examples of that, and some very, very useful work has emerged from that kind of radicalisation of people under that kind of pressure. And George Lukács himself started out as a literary critic, as a very aesthetic bourgeois theorist, really, of the sort of Weberian school. It was the experience of the First World War that made him become a communist, a commissar in the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic, fought at the front, converted him to Marxism. So that process is an old process, but it does rather underline the point I'm making, that it's the kind of eruption of social struggles into what was previously, in Lukács's case, quite classic academic life, which entirely radicalised his life and his worldview for the rest of his existence, really. And that's, kind of underlines that point. Finally, on the question of the Vanguard Party, or Leninist Party, or however you want to describe it. Of course, it's a widely criticised model for all sorts of historical reasons, but I would say there's one absolutely fundamental and inescapable reason why it's not an outdated idea, and that is because although it's commonly kind of described as if it's the creation of a kind of body of people who are already Marxists, they decide to create this vanguard party, and this vanguard party will lead the working class. Actually, that's a completely un-Marxist way of looking at what's happening. I think the more materialist, the more Marxist way of looking at this is that it's a product of what happens in the class struggle anyway. There is, whatever we decide to do, a vanguard spontaneously arising in the struggle. In London today, there is a vanguard of people. There are radicalised students in the colleges over Palestine, over the war, over the cuts. And there are groups of people who've come to the conclusion, one way or another, that the system's bankrupt and something ought to replace it that's better than this. That's among the students. Among the construction workers, there are construction workers who've been blocking Fleet Street, who've been demanding that the sites be unionised, who are engaged in very radical action. They're not the whole of the building workers, by the way. There are 200 or 300 building workers who've been sparked, who've been doing this on the rail. There's people going out on strike. Among the civil servants, there are people who are planning to strike now. And there are people who, in every union branch and every workplace, are putting forward these arguments, who are encouraging others, who are leading the struggle, who are putting forward motions, who are trying to get their friends to act with them. So a vanguard exists. They are a minority of people who are seeking to get others to take action alongside them, proposing ways of moving forward, the Occupy people, and so forth and so on, all over London and all over the country. And internationally, there is already existing a vanguard of people. The only question is whether or not they will, and this was one of Lukács's most brilliant phrases, he said the only question is whether the vanguard will assemble in the form of an organisation. In other words, will all these people, or as many of them as possible, who are already beginning to fight, who are already beginning to lead struggles, will they come together in an organisation? And the reason they should come together in an organisation is because collectively we're more powerful than we are in isolation. Because in an organisation it's possible to transmit the history of the movement, to analyse and debate how the society is working, to come towards a strategic conception of how we can all act together to make ourselves more effective. And that seems to me is, in a non-academic term, that is a no-brainer. It is an absolute no-brainer that we are better bringing together the already existing vanguard of people who are trying to fight in an organisation which gives a publication, or a website, or meetings, or a history of struggles that can make us more effective than we would be in isolation. It seems to me that anybody who's practically trying to change the world could hardly have an objection to such an absolutely simple and basic notion. And it seems to me that for those reasons, that idea is not it is not a dead idea. You know, Leon Trotsky put it the same way. He said the first 5 workers that he ever met in his life told him everything that you need to know about socialist organisation. He said one of them was a complete reactionary, a complete sexist, a complete racist. If he died and went to heaven and there was a strike on the gates of heaven, he'd scab on that. Absolutely irremovable reactionary. So there was one who was a socialist, a trade unionist, who would always stand up for the oppressed, and there were 3 in the middle who could sometimes be influenced by the one reactionary and isolate the socialist, and sometimes they could be won by the socialist and isolate the reactionary. He said the purpose of socialist organisation is to bring together the 1 in 5 workers who's willing to fight, to make them more effective on winning the people in the middle and isolate the right wing, and not allow them to remain in isolation, and therefore for the right wing to have more chance of winning the people in the middle and isolate the left. And we've seen in the history of the last 100 years what it looks like when the left loses. It looks like the First World War, it looks like the triumph of fascism, it looks like the Holocaust, it looks like the rise of Golden Dawn in Greece. They are high stakes, and there are high stakes in this country in the coming years. So the business of organisation is, if you ask me, late, and we need to hurry.